Christmas night, 1944. The Ardennes forest lies buried under snow and silence. The trees stand motionless, their branches heavy with frost, their shadows stretching across a landscape swallowed by darkness. A thick fog rolls between them, dense enough to hide entire columns of men. It is the kind of night soldiers pray for. No moon, no visibility, perfect cover. Out of that darkness, they move. 702 German soldiers advance in disciplined formation, veterans, survivors of the Eastern Front, where winter itself had been an enemy more brutal than bullets. These are not inexperienced recruits. These are hardened men who know how to move quietly, how to wait, how to endure. They are crossing a river. The water is black, slow, freezing. Boots slip against submerged rocks. Equipment clinks softly despite every effort to stay silent. Orders are whispered, never spoken. Every man knows what is at stake. Surprise is everything. Above them, there is nothing. No aircraft, no searchlights, no artillery flashes in the distance. The sky is empty. To them, it feels like safety. Then something happens. Not an explosion, not a flash, not the sharp crack of incoming fire, just air. A sudden, violent disturbance in the air around them, a pressure wave, invisible, immediate, and deadly. Men begin to fall. At first, it's confusion. A soldier stumbles, another drops his rifle, a third collapses mid-step without a sound. There are no wounds anyone can immediately see. No blood sprayed across the snow, no obvious impact. Then more fall, and more. Panic spreads faster than understanding. Officers shout commands that vanish into the fog. Some men dive for cover that doesn't exist. Others fire blindly into the darkness, aiming at nothing, shooting at shadows, at the sky, at the forest itself. But there is nothing to hit. The air itself seems to be killing them. Within minutes, the formation breaks. Discipline dissolves into chaos. Soldiers who have survived years of war suddenly find themselves in a battle they cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot comprehend. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it's over. Silence returns. The forest stands exactly as it did before. The fog still hangs low. The river continues its slow, indifferent flow. By morning, all 702 men are dead. No crater marks the ground, no shattered trees point to artillery strikes, there are no direct hits, no evidence of conventional weapons. The bodies lie where they fell, as if the life had simply been taken out of them mid-motion. When German command investigates, the confusion only deepens. They search for fragments, for shrapnel, for anything that could explain what happened. What they find is strange. Small metal pieces, scattered and seemingly insignificant. Nothing that resembles the remains of a powerful explosive. Nothing that explains the scale of the destruction. The conclusion they reach is almost dismissive. A timed shell, they say, a mechanical fuse, something that detonated above the formation, perhaps by coincidence, perhaps by crude design. Dangerous, yes, but not revolutionary, not something that changes the nature of war. But that explanation doesn't hold, because this wasn't a single shell, it wasn't luck, and it wasn't mechanical. What happened that night in the Ardennes was the result of a weapon so advanced, so unexpected, that even some of the world's best engineers couldn't recognize it for what it was, even when they held it in their hands. To understand why, you have to step back, before this night, before the forest, before the war reached its final, desperate phase. At the time, the idea behind this weapon was considered impossible. Not difficult, not impractical, impossible. The problem was simple to describe, but nearly insoluble in practice. How do you make a weapon explode at exactly the right moment without touching its target? Artillery had always relied on impact or timing.
A shell hits something, it explodes, or it's set to detonate after a fixed number of seconds. But both methods had limitations. Aircraft moved too fast, infantry spread out. Timing could never be precise enough. What engineers wanted was something different, a shell that could sense its target, a shell that could decide when to detonate, a shell that didn't need to hit anything at all. In theory, it sounded like science fiction. In practice, it ran into a wall of physics and engineering. The components required, sensors, transmitters, receivers, were too large, too fragile, too unreliable. And even if they could be built, how could they survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a gun? Tens of thousands of G-forces, enough to crush delicate electronics instantly. Experts dismissed the idea outright. It couldn't be done. Not in a laboratory, not on a battlefield, not at all. And yet, by late 1944, something very much like that was already in use. Something small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, something strong enough to survive being fired, something precise enough to detonate at exactly the moment it passed near a target, whether that target was an aircraft in the sky or a group of soldiers moving through a forest. On that Christmas night, the German battalion didn't see flashes because the explosions weren't meant to be seen. They didn't hear incoming shells because the weapon didn't rely on impact. They were caught in the optimal kill zone of something designed not just to explode, but to know when to explode. The efficiency of what happened in the Ardennes wasn't an accident. It was the result of calculation, of design, of a system that had quietly crossed the line from theory into reality, while most of the world still believed it couldn't exist. And the most unsettling part? The soldiers who died that night never had the chance to understand what was happening to them, because by the time the weapon revealed itself, it had already done its job.
For most of human history, weapons followed a simple rule. They only worked when they touched something. A bullet hits a body. A shell strikes the ground. A bomb impacts a target. Cause and effect were visible, predictable, and, at least in theory, understandable. But by the late 1930s, that logic was becoming a problem. Aircraft were getting faster. They could fly higher, maneuver quicker, and attack with less warning. Anti-aircraft gunners faced an impossible task. They had to predict where a plane would be in the future, not where it was. They fired shells into empty sky, hoping that timing alone would bring the explosion close enough to do damage. Most of the time it didn't. Even when shells burst near a target, the results were inconsistent. Too early, and the fragments scattered harmlessly behind the aircraft. Too late, and the plane had already passed through the danger zone. Direct hits were rare. And in war, rare is not good enough. Engineers across the world knew the limitation. Germany knew it. Britain knew it. The United States knew it. And they all arrived at the same theoretical solution: a shell that could sense proximity. A weapon that didn't need to hit. The concept was deceptively simple. If a shell could detect when it was near a target, close enough for its fragments to be lethal, it could detonate at exactly the right moment, not based on time, not based on impact, but based on distance. In modern terms, it sounds obvious. At the time, it sounded impossible. Because to make that work, the shell would need something extraordinary inside it, not just explosives, but electronics, a system capable of sending out a signal, receiving a reflection, and interpreting that reflection in real time. In other words, a tiny radar. And that's where the idea collapsed. Radar itself was still a young technology. The systems used during the early years of the war were massive, filling entire rooms, requiring stable platforms, constant power, and careful calibration. They were delicate, sensitive, absolutely unsuited for the violent environment of artillery. Now imagine taking that entire system and shrinking it down to fit inside a metal cylinder small enough to be fired from a gun.
Then imagine that cylinder being launched at thousands of miles per hour, spinning rapidly, subjected to forces that would crush most materials. And after surviving all of that, the system would need to turn on, function perfectly, and make a split-second decision in midair. The overwhelming consensus among scientists was clear. It could not be done. Not with the materials available, not with the electronics of the time, not under those conditions. Even if you could build such a device, it would never survive being fired. Vacuum tubes, the core components of early electronics, were made of glass, fragile, easily shattered, completely incompatible with extreme acceleration. The idea wasn't just difficult, it violated the practical limits of engineering. So most nations moved on. They improved what they already had: better timing mechanisms, more accurate calculations, larger volumes of fire. Incremental changes to an imperfect system. But in the United States, a small group of scientists refused to let the idea go. Among them were physicists, engineers, and thinkers who believed that the problem wasn't impossible, it was just unsolved. One of the key figures in this effort was James Van Allen, a young scientist who would later become famous for discoveries far beyond the battlefield. At the time, he and others were working on a problem that most of their peers considered a dead end. They began to rethink everything. If traditional vacuum tubes were too fragile, could they be redesigned, reinforced, made smaller? Could circuits be simplified to the bare minimum needed to function? Could the entire system be built not for comfort or stability, but for survival under extreme stress? Every assumption had to be challenged. The environment inside a fired shell is unlike anything most devices ever experience. Acceleration forces can exceed 20,000 times the force of gravity. The shell spins at incredible speeds, creating additional stress and instability. Temperatures fluctuate, vibrations are constant. Anything that wasn't perfectly secured would break. Anything that wasn't perfectly designed would fail. So the challenge became not just about creating a radar system, but creating one that could endure violence, chaos, and speed, and still function with absolute precision. And then there was another problem: power. A radar system needs energy, but a shell has no external power source, no wires, no continuous supply. Whatever energy it uses must be contained entirely within it, and must activate at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the battery drains before the shell reaches its target. Too late, and the system never turns on at all. Timing once again becomes critical, but now at a completely different level. As the scientists worked through these problems, progress was slow. Failures were constant. Prototypes shattered under testing. Circuits failed unpredictably. Signals were inconsistent. At every step, reality seemed to confirm what the experts had said from the beginning: this shouldn't work. But then, gradually, something began to change. Small breakthroughs, reinforced components that survived testing, circuits that held together under stress, signals that, for brief moments, behaved exactly as intended. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was enough to prove one thing: the impossible might not be impossible after all. And once that line was crossed, even slightly, the entire nature of the problem shifted. Because now it wasn't about whether it could be done, it was about how fast it could be made to work. Behind closed doors, the project gained urgency. Resources were quietly redirected, secrecy increased. The stakes were no longer theoretical. If this technology could be perfected, it wouldn't just improve existing weapons, it would redefine them. A shell that could sense its target wouldn't just be more effective, it would change the rules of engagement entirely. Aircraft could be destroyed without direct hits. Infantry could be caught in invisible bursts of lethal force. Entire formations could be neutralized without ever understanding what had hit them. And perhaps most importantly, the enemy wouldn't know how it worked. Because from the outside, it would look like something else: a timed explosion, a lucky shot, a coincidence. The true mechanism would remain hidden, buried inside fragments too small, too complex and too unfamiliar to be recognized. By the time German engineers encountered these weapons in large numbers, that deception would already be in place. They would examine the pieces, they would study the design, and they would reach the wrong conclusion. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because the idea itself still seemed impossible. What they were holding wasn't just a new type of fuse. It was the first practical step towards a world where weapons could sense, decide, and act without direct contact. A world where the battlefield itself became unpredictable. And by the winter of 1944, that world had already arrived, quietly, invisibly, and with devastating precision.
By the time the theory began to hold together, the real challenge was no longer science, it was production. Designing a working prototype in controlled conditions is one thing. Building it once, carefully, with expert hands and unlimited time, that's difficult but manageable. Building it tens of thousands of times, quickly, cheaply, and reliably in the middle of a global war, that's something else entirely. Because what had been created was not just a weapon, it was a contradiction. A device small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, yet complex enough to contain a functioning electronic system. Fragile in principle, yet required to survive forces that would destroy most machinery. Precise to the point of milliseconds, yet expected to work in the chaos of combat. And every single unit had to perform perfectly. One failure meant one shell wasted. Thousands of failures meant the entire concept collapsed. So the question became, how do you mass produce something that until recently was considered impossible to build even once? The answer began in an unlikely place, not in a massive industrial complex, not in a government laboratory filled with advanced equipment, but in a converted garage. Inside the facilities of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, early work on the proximity fuse took place in spaces that looked almost improvised. Workbenches crowded with components, tools scattered between experiments, scientists and engineers working long hours, solving problems as they appeared, often with no clear roadmap. This wasn't polished, orderly innovation. This was controlled chaos. Ideas were tested, broken, rebuilt, and tested again. Components were modified by hand. Designs changed daily. What mattered wasn't elegance, it was survival. Every part had to endure extreme acceleration, violent rotation, and sudden shock. And slowly, piece by piece, the design stabilized. But stability in the lab didn't solve the bigger problem. War doesn't wait for perfection. The United States needed not dozens, not hundreds, but millions of these devices, and they needed them fast. To make that happen, the project had to leave the garage and enter the factory. That transition introduced a new kind of challenge. Factories rely on standardization, repeatability, workers performing specialized tasks, often without full knowledge of the final product. But how do you standardize something so complex that even experts struggle to fully understand it? The solution was as strategic as it was secretive. The process was broken down into steps so small that no single worker saw the entire system. Across the country, thousands of people, many of them women entering industrial work for the first time, were assigned specific repetitive tasks: soldering tiny components, assembling miniature circuits, sealing delicate parts into protective casings. They were told they were working on electrical devices. Some believed they were assembling parts for radios. Others thought they were building advanced light bulbs. Almost none of them knew they were constructing one of the most sophisticated weapons of the war. In total, around 10,000 workers became part of this hidden network of production, and secrecy was absolute. Even a small leak of information could compromise the entire program.
If the enemy understood how the device worked, they might find a way to counter it, or worse, replicate it. So information was compartmentalized. Each factory knew its part. Each worker knew its task. The full design existed in only a handful of minds. Meanwhile, engineers faced an ongoing battle against failure. Early production units didn't always survive testing. Some failed under acceleration. Others malfunctioned mid-flight. Tiny imperfections, barely visible, could render an entire shell useless. Quality control became an obsession. Every component was tested, every assembly inspected, standards tightened again and again until failure rates dropped to acceptable levels. But even as reliability improved, another problem remained: cost. The first working versions of this device were incredibly expensive, around $732 per unit. In wartime terms, that was unsustainable. At that price, mass deployment was impossible. So engineers and manufacturers worked to simplify. Unnecessary components were removed, designs were refined, materials were optimized, production methods were streamlined. Gradually, the cost began to fall, from $732 to $100, from $100 to $50, and eventually to around $18 per unit. At that price, everything changed. Now the weapon could be produced at scale, not in limited quantities, not reserved for special operations, but in massive numbers, tens of thousands per day. By the peak of production, factories were turning out up to 70,000 units daily. What had once been an experimental concept was now an industrial product, reliable, affordable, available in overwhelming quantity. And still, to almost everyone involved, it remained a mystery. Workers continued assembling parts without knowing their purpose. Shipments moved under strict security. Even many military units using the weapon didn't fully understand how it worked. They only knew one thing: it worked. The transformation from fragile prototype to mass-produced weapon wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a logistical one. It required coordination between scientists, engineers, factory workers, and military planners, all operating under intense secrecy, all racing against time. And it succeeded. By the time these devices reached the battlefield in significant numbers, they carried with them not just explosive power, but the weight of an entire hidden system behind them. A system that had taken an idea declared impossible and forced it into reality. And yet, the most remarkable part was still to come, because no matter how advanced a weapon is, its true value is only proven in one place: not in the lab, not in the factory, but in combat. And when this weapon was finally unleashed at scale, the results would be so effective, so unexpected, that even the enemy holding it in their hands would fail to understand what they were looking at.
By late 1944, the weapon was ready. Not as a prototype, not as an experiment, but as a fully operational system produced in massive numbers and quietly delivered to the front lines. At first, its use was cautious. Commanders understood its potential, but they also understood the risk. If even one intact unit fell into enemy hands, the secret could be exposed. The technology could be studied, replicated, or countered. So early deployments were carefully controlled. But war has a way of accelerating decisions, and nowhere was that more evident than in the skies. Before this weapon, anti-aircraft fire was as much art as science. Gunners relied on prediction, experience, and luck. They filled the air with explosions, hoping that one of them would intersect with a moving aircraft at just the right moment. Most of the time they missed, but when proximity fuses were introduced, everything changed almost overnight. Now, shells didn't need to hit aircraft directly, they only needed to get close. As a shell approached a target, its internal system activated. A signal was emitted, reflected back, and analyzed in fractions of a second.
At the precise moment the shell passed within lethal range, it detonated. Not too early, not too late, exactly when it needed to. The difference in effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. Aircraft that would have survived near misses were now caught in perfectly timed bursts of shrapnel. Pilots who once relied on speed and altitude for protection suddenly found themselves vulnerable in ways they couldn't anticipate. The sky itself had become more dangerous. And then came the Pacific. By 1945, the United States Navy was facing one of the most terrifying tactics of the war: kamikaze attacks. Pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft into ships, turning themselves into guided weapons. Traditional defenses struggled to stop them. Even when ships opened fire at maximum range, many attackers still got through. The margin for error was too small. A single aircraft slipping past defenses could cause catastrophic damage. This is where the proximity fuse proved its true value. With it, naval anti-aircraft fire became exponentially more effective. Shells bursting near incoming aircraft shredded wings, damaged engines, and disrupted flight paths before the planes could reach their targets. The change wasn't subtle, it was decisive. One of the most striking examples came aboard the destroyer USS Hadley, DD-774, during the Battle of Okinawa. On May 11, 1945, the ship was attacked by an overwhelming wave of kamikaze aircraft. One after another, they came in low and fast, attempting to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers. The crew responded with everything they had. Using proximity-fused shells, their guns filled the sky with invisible kill zones. Aircraft entering those zones didn't need to be hit directly. They were torn apart by precisely timed detonations. Planes exploded mid-air. Others broke apart before reaching the ship. The defensive fire was relentless, accurate, and devastating. In a single engagement, the ship helped destroy or damage an extraordinary number of attacking aircraft, setting a record for defensive firepower that still stands as one of the most intense anti-aircraft battles ever fought. And yet, even with that level of defense, the attack was so massive that some aircraft still got through. The ship was hit, fires broke out, damage spread. But without that weapon, the outcome would have been far worse. Much worse. Back in Europe, the same technology was being used in a different way, against infantry. Artillery shells equipped with proximity fuses were fired not to strike the ground, but to detonate above it, just a few meters overhead, right where their fragments would spread out in the most lethal pattern. For soldiers on the ground, the effect was devastating. Traditional shells often buried themselves before exploding, wasting much of their energy in the earth. But airbursts maximized exposure. Shrapnel rained down over a wide area, striking from above where cover was weakest. Foxholes offered less protection. Trenches became less effective. Even prone soldiers were vulnerable. And because the detonation happened in the air, there was often no warning, no impact, no visible incoming threat. Just sudden, lethal force. This is what German forces encountered during battles like the Battle of the Bulge. Units moving under cover of darkness, believing themselves concealed, suddenly found themselves caught in bursts of explosions that seemed to come from nowhere. The pattern was too precise to be random, too consistent to be coincidence, but the cause remained unclear. When German forces managed to capture large quantities of these shells, around 20,000 units, they believed they had found an opportunity. Here was the enemy's new advantage, now in their hands. They disassembled the devices, studied the components, analyzed the design, and reached a conclusion: mechanical timing. A refined fuse, perhaps, cleverly engineered, but nothing fundamentally new. They were wrong. What they held wasn't just a better version of existing technology, it was an entirely different category. But their assumption made sense, because the alternative required accepting something they had already dismissed as impossible: that a shell could contain a working electronic system, that it could detect proximity, that it could make a decision in flight. Without that framework, the evidence pointed somewhere else, so they misread it. And in war, misunderstanding your enemy's capabilities can be just as dangerous as lacking them. Because while they analyzed fragments and drew conclusions, the weapon continued to be used, quietly, efficiently, and with devastating results. It didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need to be understood. It only needed to work. And by the final months of the war, it had already proven something remarkable, that a single innovation, hidden inside a shell, invisible to those it targeted, could shift the balance of entire battles. Not through overwhelming force, but through precision, through timing, through an understanding of exactly when to act. And for those caught beneath it, there was no defense against something they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and never had time to understand.
By the time the war ended, the weapon had already done its work. It had altered battles, saved ships, and silently increased the effectiveness of entire armies. And yet, unlike the atomic bomb, it did not announce itself with a single world-shaking moment. There was no blinding flash that forced the world to pay attention, no city that became its symbol. Instead, its impact was scattered across forests, across oceans, across thousands of engagements where something subtle but decisive had changed. And because of that, it remained largely invisible. Even in victory, it stayed classified. The full details of its design, its production, and its capabilities were locked away, not just from the public, but from many within the military itself. The reason was simple. This was not a weapon tied to a single war. It was a technological breakthrough. And breakthroughs don't expire when peace is declared. They evolve, they spread. Sometimes they are stolen. Because while the United States had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect the secret, no system is completely secure. Somewhere along the line, information began to leak. Not through a dramatic betrayal, not through a single catastrophic failure, but through quiet, deliberate espionage. One of the most significant breaches came from an American engineer named Julius Rosenberg. Working within networks that passed sensitive information to the Soviet Union, Rosenberg played a role in transferring critical knowledge about advanced U.S. technologies. Among the materials handed over were details related to the proximity fuse. The method was almost mundane. Documents concealed in everyday objects, information passed in ways designed to avoid attention. At one point, components and notes were reportedly moved in something as ordinary as a lunchbox. There was no dramatic chase, no immediate discovery, just information quietly changing hands. For the Soviet Union, this was invaluable. Developing such a system from scratch would have taken years, perhaps longer, but with access to American designs, that timeline shortened dramatically. What had once been a closely guarded advantage began to spread beyond its origin. And like many technologies born in war, it did not remain limited to its original purpose. The principles behind the proximity fuse, detection, timing, automated response, would go on to influence entire generations of weapons systems. Missiles, air defense networks, smart munitions. The idea that a weapon could sense its environment and act accordingly became not just accepted, but expected. What had once been dismissed as impossible became standard. But there is another layer to this story, a human one. Among those who witnessed the first successful uses of this weapon was James Van Allen, one of the scientists involved in its development. He saw firsthand how a theoretical concept had become a practical, deadly reality. Later, his work would take him far from the battlefield, into space, into the study of radiation belts surrounding the Earth, into discoveries that would redefine humanity's understanding of its own planet. But during the war, his focus was much closer to the ground, closer to the moment when an idea proved itself under fire. And then there was another connection, one that ties this story to a far more widely known event.
among those involved in the proximity fuse program, would later contribute to the development and deployment of the atomic bomb. Among them was Louis Slotin, a physicist who worked on nuclear assembly procedures and was present during critical stages of the Manhattan Project. He was there when the first atomic weapon was prepared for use, a weapon that would be dropped on Hiroshima under the code name Little Boy. Two very different technologies, one announced with a single devastating moment, the other dispersed across countless invisible ones. Yet both emerged from the same environment, an urgent race to solve problems once thought unsolvable. Looking back, it's easy to focus on the dramatic, the explosions, the headlines, the events that force themselves into memory. But wars are not decided by moments alone. They are decided by systems, by production lines that never stop, by ideas that quietly reshape the rules, by innovations that the enemy never fully understands. The proximity fuse was one of those innovations. It didn't replace artillery, it didn't replace strategy, but it amplified them, turning near misses into kills, turning defense into dominance, turning uncertainty into precision. And perhaps most importantly, it did so without revealing itself. German engineers held it in their hands and misidentified it. Soldiers experienced its effects and couldn't explain them. Even today, its story is often overshadowed by louder, more visible technologies. But if you trace the outcomes, if you follow the data, the reports, the after-action analyses, you begin to see its true impact, not as a single event, but as a pattern, a consistent, measurable shift in effectiveness wherever it was used. And that brings us back to the forest, back to that Christmas night in 1944. 702 soldiers moving under perfect cover, no light, no warning, no visible threat. And yet, by morning, none of them remained. Not because they were outmatched in numbers, not because they made a fatal mistake, but because they encountered something they did not understand, a weapon that did not need to hit them, a weapon that did not need to be seen, a weapon that in many ways had already changed the nature of the battlefield before they even knew it existed. And in war, that kind of advantage is the most dangerous of all, the kind you never see coming.